All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another pro tip here on preachingforward.com. I'm excited to be joined by one of my great friends out on the East Coast. I'm coming from the West Coast, East Coast, Mike Signorelli. Come on.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Let's go. Let's do this.
So you're based out in Long Island, NYC. Your church. Give us a quick overview, and then we'll jump into talking about preaching here.
Quick overview, man. I'm an Italian hillbilly from Indiana that has got one foot. A V1 Church has got one foot on Long Island and one in New York City. We're getting ready to launch our second location in Queens, and it's we're just doing it for Jesus, man.
Come
Out here in the
on,
concrete jungle.
love it. I've heard that's where dreams are made of. I don't know. Well,
It's where dreams die too. Dreams
that's
die here
a
as well.
little bit of both. Well,
Uh,
hey, I'll have to get out there, just not in January.
I was
So,
gonna say, man, we're waiting for you, but we don't want to transition you like that. You might not ever come back.
okay, so let's talk a little bit about uh, preaching. And today let's talk about kind of these two different words here: the call and the craft of preaching. I think sometimes we can get caught up on one or the other and not really develop maybe or fully understand. But I think first of all, truly, if you're preaching, it's not because you just want to be someone who gives good talks.
Yeah,
I'm pretty passionate about this topic. Like, you don't just become a preacher because you kind of felt like it one day. Like, you're called to do it or you're not. Okay,
yeah,
so don't. This isn't like a motivational speaker career choice.
right,
you
right.
know, if God has called you to preach, then actually it's not just an option; it's what you must do. Right?
Yeah,
It's gotta come out the inside of you. So that call is super crucial. But then there's the craft side of it. So I know you said you kind of have a bit of a crazy story of your first call, your first preaching.
yeah. Well,
Scene.
yeah, I'll jump it off. I'll try to tell the quick version, but the reality for me is that I'm an introvert, and people don't believe me. I recently took this Arno profiling test for your personality,
Yep.
and the guy who administered the test actually said, "Man, Sundays are probably really rough on you, aren't they? Because you show up so introverted on this test. Like, how do you?" And for me, I was the kid playing the green screen Game Boy, hiding in the back of church. My mom forced me to go. And at 15 years old, and this is my supernatural, the calling element of it, was at 15 years old, I left a church service and this woman came to pick her kid up who lived on the block. And we were in the barrio, we were in the south side of Chicago in a Spanish neighborhood. And she literally was like, "Ay Dios mío, I've seen you in a dream before, and you were preaching at my church, and revival broke out." And she had never met me before, and my response to her wasn't like, "Oh, praise God, yes, I'll go." It actually was, I literally said verbatim, like, woman, you're crazy. I'll translate that for you. You're loco. And I was like, I'm never gonna do that. That's not for me. And then through a series of events, my youth pastor basically like said, "You know what, we'll get behind you. Maybe you can do it." I preached that first sermon, and I literally changed. Like, I went from the introvert to the extrovert, and
Wow.
I'm still doing it. So for me, that initial calling, it was supernatural. It wasn't like I was trying to build my social media presence. It wasn't like I was trying to feed my ego. I
Right.
was literally trying to beat the next level of Super Mario on my Game Boy. When I call it a divine disruption.
Yep. Yep.
My life was divinely disrupted, and I've never been the same since that moment.
So good.
So that's my calling story. If you
Dude, that
will.
that's incredible. And it's those moments, right? Whether it's the call to preach or church planting or whatever it is, you gotta have those divine moments,
Yeah,
those prophetic words, those signs you can look to, because when things get difficult, when you're walking through difficult seasons,
come
you
on.
can't just survive off this was my career path. You
Ex-
survive and thrive because you're like, no, no, no. This is without a shadow of a doubt the calling that I've been given. And so now we got the call. I know that was a
Yeah.
real brushed over overview of that concept,
Yeah.
but you and I were kind of chatting a little bit about the craft side of it. That's the practitioner. That's the
Hmm.
developing the expertise, and maybe talk a little bit about that whole concept. I think you were saying some people feel like, oh no, that you don't really develop the craft of preaching, but
Yeah, that's such a well. I'll tell you this: at 15 years old, with no theological training, with having never done it before, I did start to preach. I felt like I got hit by a bolt of lightning, and I started to communicate. And that woman's dream that she had really did come to pass. I mean, all these young people accepted Christ, which was a catalyst for their parents to get ignited, and then that whole church was, it was. But what happens, and I think you said it's there's a duality because on one hand, in the difficult times, you go back to those stories and you say, man, it was supernatural. But then the other thing is there's a trap waiting for you, and it's in relying on that and
right.
saying, you know what, without the training, without the, that happened. And I think what happens is initially you get that triple dose of grace and God jumps you off. But I think, if you have a story like me, I've heard other really famous communicators stories of them being terrible when they started and getting better. So I've heard all the above.
Yep.
But for me, that story I told was 20 years ago now. And it's crazy because I've had to adapt, and there's a craft, and I feel like that's been the theme of my life is I'm out here, man, in this crazy environment of New York City and Long Island where less than 2% of this entire population identifies as an evangelical Christian,
Yeah. Wow.
which means there were no shortcuts. And I came from this mega church in Indiana, man, where I preached there and standing ovations, everyone's going crazy, and you just like you drop the Christianese, you drop those phrases that are going to work. And then I got my preacher butt whooped out here because I was given the best I had, and
Yep.
it was like you could hear a pin needle drop. They didn't even have enough Christian culture to say amen. Matter of fact, now that I've been on this journey, a lot of our church people have said I was afraid to make noise in church because
Right.
my previous church experience was you just sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
talking back to you while you were preaching was like sacrilegious. So for me, I feel like there's the calling and then there's the craft,
Yeah.
and I feel you have to develop both of those arenas have to be honored in
Yep.
order to be more effective. So that's my journey where I'm at right now.
I love that, and I do think so, sometimes it's almost like that artist who gets a little offended when you don't like their design. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And you say like, "Hey, but maybe tweak this just a little bit," and they're like, "Whoa, whoa! If I designed it, it's perfect in its original state, needs no
Right.
alterations, right?" Well, we all know that if you're going to be a great designer, you have to be willing to take that feedback to
Yeah.
produce the right product. And I think it's kind of similar in the preaching. It's like if as a preacher I have some type of notion that my first time delivering or my first kind of iteration of this message I feel God has given me is perfect and flawless. First of all, I must think I'm Jesus. But secondly, I'm living in a reality that isn't consistent. That I have to understand that I actually have to learn how to communicate in a way that people can actually receive it, get it, understand it. And this proves itself out true even when you're preaching multiple services. Usually, by the last time you preach it, you're feeling like, okay, now I got it, right? Well, well, does that mean that you didn't hear from God for service number one? Or does it
Right.
just mean that you fine tuned, tweaked, dialed in,
Yeah.
developed the craft to communicate this unbelievable message in the most effective way now that you're kind of a couple tries deep in it? So I feel
Yeah.
like little things like that give us windows at, hey, you know what? We can be more effective. Now, at the end of the day, I'm a champion of the verse when Paul talks about I didn't come with just wise and persuasive words
Yeah.
so that your faith would rest on human wisdom, but I came with a demonstration of the
Yeah.
Spirit's power. So at the end of the day, it's not about being slick in communication as the be and end all. At the end of the day, we got to have some juice, right? There's got to be some
Yeah.
power behind it. There's got to be some people getting set free. But to foolishly think that I can say a message however I want to say it in whatever tone, whatever flow, whatever, and just go, well, it's up to the listener to just deal with it. Well, then I'm being foolish with the gift. So
Yeah.
for you, maybe some thoughts on that, but what are some ways you feel like you've honed your craft? How are you sharpening that skill?
Yeah, I love to talk about preaching. I mean, I've devoted my entire life to the craft of preaching, and there's so much wisdom in everything that you just said. And to kind of extend off that, like, so I come from a music background, and you know, you Prince is like obviously like renowned, right? And he's like Purple Rain,
Yeah.
you know.
Sing it.
But the thing about Prince that shocked me to learn is that when he would cook up new material, he would get it all together, iron it out with his band, and then they would have listening parties at his house. And he would bring in people who were not musicians, people who, you know, basically didn't have all the expertise in the, and he would basically play the songs for him and say, "What do you guys think?" And that was his secret sauce, was actually taking their mojo and adding it
Wow.
into his hits. And you know, it's funny because a lot of times as preachers, the only opinion we think we should care about is if Furtick called us and was like, "Hey man, I was listening to your podcast. I've got some great insights for you. But what about like the single mom from your church?
Come
You
on,
know,
dude.
what about like the dude who just recently accepted Christ?" I'll take it a step further. What about the atheist who still doesn't believe?
Right.
So I started to put together like listening parties, if you will, for my content, and just the first time I'm communicating, it's not on the stage, it's to people, and it's not to other preachers or other super Christians. But
Right.
I'll tell you what, man, it takes a huge amount of humility,
Yeah.
you know, to basically say, because I come from that era where it was like you preach for an hour straight, you know, you are an oracle of God, which means whether, you know, if you could be quoting Star Wars or the Bible, it all has the same weight. You know, it's like, and so for me to come out of that era
Yep.
into this has been a real, but at the same time, man, here's the thing. For every listening party I've had where I've, you know, actually said, "Here's what I want to say," and now what'll happen is if I can speak to that single mother, that atheist, that person who just accepted Christ, then when I come on a Sunday and you've got a couple hundred people or more in the audience, every atheistic person saying, "Man, it's like he's speaking right to me."
Right.
You
That's
know,
good.
and so that for me, it's like, and that's the thing that we forget about Paul. Like Paul was out among the people. You know, I think like what we have recorded in Scripture only encapsulates a little bit of the conversations he was having all the time.
Yep. Yeah.
So yeah, I believe he was doing the same thing, you
Yep.
know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I mean, Paul, Jesus. I mean, they are speaking in the language of their audience. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And I think we all can forget that that the truths were wrapped up in a packaging that
yeah,
the listeners understood, made sense to them, and so we have to go, instead of just saying, well, hey, here's dinner, like it or leave it. We have to think to ourselves, what do they want to eat, and how are they going to receive it best? And
yeah,
not that we're skipping out on the difficult parts of the Bible because maybe they
yeah,
don't want to hear that, but just the sense of like, hey, I have to understand that I want as many people as possible to walk away anytime you preach
yeah,
with going like, I got it, I loved it, I was able to take a bite of that, chew it, digest it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
huge. So, for you, I mean, obviously, you've been preaching for 20 years or plus, and you gotta, what, is it just the reps? Is it, how do you study, who you study, and what were some things for you that helped you develop the craft?
For me, and you know, I'm nowhere near, you know, the best communicator ever, but I think there's a fine line between being like critical of yourself and being humble, you know. And it's for me, I've approached every single, and maybe this is the introversion and the way I'm wired, but I've approached every single sermon I've ever preached as if it was the first one I ever preached.
Mm,
And I think, you
good.
know, whether I've preached overseas through translators in many countries, I've preached all across the U.S., but every single time I come with that, like, I've never done this before mentality. And I think for me, that's been so important, because I think the audience knows. It's like you said, you use the analogy of cooking a meal and being like, there's something when you know somebody labored over that meal, even if they fall short in certain ingredients of it, that you're tasting the love just as much as you're
Right.
tasting the efficiency. I
Yeah.
feel like for me, the number one compliment I've always gotten across cultures has not been, wow, he's so eloquent. It hasn't even always been, wow, he blew my mind, but it's always been, he's so authentic.
Mm.
And
Good,
I get
man.
a lot of like young preachers always asking me, because they hear people from our church say that, and they're like, how do you say that about me? I'm like, dude, you got to get in there, love people, do life with them, and the only way to be authentic is to actually be authentic. But
Yeah.
I think it's like it's being like a line cook at a restaurant versus trying to be a chef to say, you know what, like you're just cranking out meals, you're just wiping the sweat off your brow waiting for a paycheck, versus like, man, and people know the difference, and they perceive that. And the weeks that, and I'm not saying it's always like a striving thing, but the weeks that I've really said, if I want to reverse engineer this experience with love, so the end game is that they know that they're, that, because I think what people are ultimately looking for is a relationship, because you can watch a TED talk and get content or whatever,
Yep.
but like, how Paul said, you have many teachers, but
Yep.
you only have one spiritual father. And I think that when the father's heart begins to come through your communication, you'll be like, man, people will tell you, dad made the best eggs ever. It's like, was your dad better than Chef Ramsay? Probably not, but he was your dad, and that was his thing.
Yep.
So I feel like for me, all that, you put that all into the craft of preaching, you try to get better. Even for me, man, like, I'm not, certainly not old, but our church attracts a lot of like people that are in that, not just the millennial, but the Generation Z. And even my really bad attempt to be relevant to them is still like, man, I love that he tried.
Yeah.
It's like, it was so cute the way he tried to throw that
Yeah.
word out there. So all that, to me, you roll that in there, it's helping you become more effective.
Yeah. I love that. I think just anyone watching, whether you're new preacher, you've been preaching for a long time, let's just not get stuck. You know what I mean? Let's not
Yeah,
get stuck the same old way or approach. If those of us who've been preaching for a while now, we have to constantly say, what's the most effective way to communicate in this era that I currently live in, not 20 years ago, not 10 years ago, but right now, what can I do to preach in a way like Jesus, like Paul, like all these who are wrapping the truth that's unchanging in a package that's now unique to this era, you know?
yeah, yeah.
So awesome. Hey, thanks so much for jumping on and joining. And y'all check out Michael and Julie Signorelli and V1 Church. I'm just so excited about what you guys are doing. And you guys, what's your podcast? People want to tune in and check that out. What's that?
Yeah, man, check it out. iTunes. It's available like almost anywhere. If you search V1 Church, you'll find it.
Cool.
V is in Victor, and then number one church, and you can see what I'm experimenting with for that week.
See what the chef's got cooking.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
awesome, man.
sir.
Love you guys. Thanks
Love
for
you so
jumping
much,
on.
man.
Talk
Yeah,
to you later.
absolutely. All right. See ya.